Welcome, people of planet Earth and all planets beyond. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Josh, and today we're going to talk about how to identify vintage Levi's 505s. So let's get into it. So much is made of the Levi's 501. It is the classic, perhaps the definition of denim jeans. But there was one element that wasn't always so popular, and that was the button fly of the jeans. The jeans that had a button fly for a closure. And this particularly, off-put women in the 1940s as they saw it as sort of immodest. So Levi's sought to address this market by adding zippers for the first time to their jeans in 1947. Levi's would later add that same zipper to men's jeans, and they released the 501Z in 1954. This was the first pair of 501s straight-leg jeans with a zipper instead of a button fly. This pair of jeans would be sold for a few years and into the 60s when along came another pair called the 502, which was a similar jean with a zipper. And this all sort of culminated when Levi's decided to release an entirely sort of new pair of straight leg zippered jeans, and they called them the 505. Sort of addressing the popularity of jeans in the late 60s with the Summer of Love and hippies. A lot of transitions were happening around this time, and so they decided to release the 505 as sort of an address to those consumers. The 505 was a straight leg jean, but it did have a zipper. There were noticeable differences, sometimes being that 505s tend to be a little bit slimmer, less relaxed around the thighs than 501s sometimes were. But this was an entirely new line, trying to somewhat distinguish itself from the 501 and the previous 501s just with zippers. The 505 would continue to be a staple in the Levi's denim lineup all the way till present day, where it is still a very popular pair of jeans. So since Levi's 505s have been around since 1967, how do we date and know how old our 505s actually are? Well, there's lots of different methods we'll talk about here in a minute, but first and foremost is the care tag. Since most 505s were produced during the era of the care tag, which was started in 1971 till present day, most of the Levi's 505s that you will encounter will have a care tag on them. And on the back of this care tag is lots of good information, specifically a date code that will tell you the month and year of production of that pair of jeans. Now, we're not going to talk about this method in detail, but you can find out more about this method in the eye above, a detailed video on all of the ins and outs of how to understand the back of the Levi's care tags. Now, since not all Levi's 505s would have originally had care tags, and many care tags are either too destroyed to read or non-existent and cut out from the jean altogether, let's talk about some other identifying factors that can help us determine the age of our 505s. Now, before we get in too deep, I do want to preface this with a little bit of a warning. And that's because a lot of these rules that we're going to talk about, a lot of these little, tricks and stuff, sometimes they have exceptions, and there are little things here and there that don't align with them, especially across such a large company with such a huge history. So you need to use a lot of these methods all at once rather than simply pick one and use that as sort of your standard, because there really are no absolutes. There are exceptions to just about every rule that I will ever mention. So with that in mind, just know that you're going to need all of these things, generally speaking, to help you really nail down some of the trickier pairs that you'll encounter. So we're going to start out with some of the earliest elements to some of the oldest pairs of 505s, and one of those first elements is selvage denim. Whether or not your 505 was made of selvage or not is an important element in identifying the age of your Levi's. And if you don't know what selvage is, there is a video in the eye above that you can watch to learn all about it, but suffice it to say, you can recognize it by the white tracks, sometimes with red lines on them, on the interior of the outseam of the pair of jeans. This was the type of denim used at the time, specifically for the 501s, but for a few years was used on the 505s at the beginning of its production. So in the earliest days, in 1967, Levi's would have used selvage denim for the 505, and it appears that they used that same denim up into the early 70s and began to transition away from selvage denim at this time, replacing the selvage denim outseam with an overlock outseam that became the norm going forward from here. Now there may have been a season where both of these styles were being produced at the same time, so if you do find a selvage denim on your 505s, you can be certain that your 505s are from some of the earliest eras and versions of the 505 from 1967. So the first 3 to 5 years you might find a selvage denim on your 505s. Another element that we can look for in identifying very early 505s is a mixture of yellow and orange thread. The yellow is probably a bit more pale yellow at this point, and the orange thread may have faded a little bit, but largely more resembles orange rather than the pale yellow version. In the late 60s, a mixture of these two threads was used, particularly on some of the interior seams that you might find. And this is a pretty good indicator that you're looking at a late 60s pair of 505s. As about the early 70s, this was being completely standardized, and the orange colored thread was winning out. So if you have a pair with that mixed thread colors, you're looking at late 60s, maybe very early 70s, but that is pretty much the range right there. Same with the selvage as we talked about before. Now this next element is not necessarily important for dating the pair of 505s that you might have, but it is helpful to distinguish it from some of the other jeans that were made at the time. The 502 was still being made into the early 70s, so you had a zippered 501 basically in the 502 and the 505 being produced at the same time, and they're often mistaken for one another. But one of the key differences that you can point out to distinguish between a 505 and a 502 is the color of the metal button that closes the top portion of the jean. In the 502, it was supposed to resemble more of the 501, so it had a silver button. And the 505, being a sort of a newer iteration, had a copper or bronze button. Now there are some rare occasions where later on in the decades to come that the 505 may have had a silver button, but largely and broadly speaking, copper was the color of the button for the 505, and that's how you can distinguish between a 502 or a 501Z from those earlier 60s from a 505. So the transition between decades from the 60s to the 70s was also a huge transition for Levi's. A lot of things were changing. We've already talked about some of the standards that they were changing from the selvage to the combination of threads and more and more. And one of the biggest transitions they made was changing the spelling of Levi's on their official marketing. They went from spelling Levi's with a capital E to a lowercase e in 1971. Now this change would also trickle down to the production of the jeans, and the red tab, which was previously spelled with a capital E, would now be spelled with a lowercase e. This is the infamous Big E you may have all heard of. Now the problem with this element is that the transition was not 100% clean right in 1971. Even Levi's website confuses this. In fact, I've found capital E Levi's that date from 1977. So you have to be a little bit careful with this axiom. Just because it has a big E does not necessarily mean it was produced prior to 1971. It's probably more accurate to say that if you have a lowercase e, your jeans was produced after 1971. So it's a little bit easier to recognize whether or not you have a lowercase e and whether or not that's helpful for dating a pair of jeans rather than uppercase E, because even to this day, Levi's is producing some of their lines with a capital E. It's being very confusing to people. So, to summarize, if your jean has a capital E, it's quite possible and more likely that you're looking at an early 70s to potentially late 60s pair of jeans, though there are exceptions. And if you have a lowercase e in your tab, on the red tab on the back of your jean, you are most definitely looking at a jean produced after 1971. Now, also in 1971, Levi's began attaching wash instructions on their jeans. They originally would stamp on the pocket bags all that information, and in 1973 they started with care tags. These are the care tags we were just referring to, and that all this good dating information can be found on these care tags. But all of that started in 1971 and 1973 respectively. So if you have a pair of 505s that have stamping on the interior pocket bag or care tag, you're looking at a gene produced after 1971 as well. So through the 1970s, largely speaking, these genes would not see a whole lot of changes until about 1978, when across most of the red tab spectrum genes, there was a subtle change made to the back pocket. As you can see, that this back pocket has a 2 rows of a single stitch that run along the inside of the back pocket. Well, in 1978, this was changed to 2 rows of chain stitching rather than single needle stitching. And this is a pretty good indicator whether or not your genes are from before 1978 or after. So if they have a single stitch there, it's before 1978, and if it has a chain stitch, it is after 1978. It is also important to note here that this does not apply evenly across all Levi's products. Orange tabs had this chain stitching for a long time prior to this, so just be aware of that. So again, as we approach the transition between decades in the 1970s to the 80s, we get some pretty significant changes in the zipper. The zippers actually can help us a lot in determining the age of our genes. Specifically because the earliest zippers that we'll find in this late 60s on 505s were a combination of Scoville, gripper, zipper, lightning, robin even. And then when we enter the 70s, and almost entirely through the 70s, we almost primarily get entirely Talon 42 zippers. So if your Levi's jeans have a gripper zipper or a Scoville zipper, it's more likely, though not entirely absolute, that it's from the late 60s. And in the 70s, because Talon 42s were pretty much the primary zipper used, that could be pretty indicative of a pair of 70s Levi's. But in the 1980s, specifically in 1980, Levi's started to transform their zippers to Levi's branded zippers. And this became the standard going forward. So if your pair of Levi's has a Levi's branded zipper, you're looking at a gene that is younger than 1980. There are, of course, some exceptions to this. I have found jeans with YKK zippers or something like that, but typically those are the exceptions. So up into the early 80s, the 505 had always been a red tab gene. Just like its brother, the 501, it was a red tab gene, not part of any of these other lines. But in the early to mid 80s, Levi's added the 505 to the orange tab line, which was a more fashion-forward line that had lots of different variations and strange and more fashionable pairs of jeans. So this was a significant undertaking, because now the 505 existed as a red tab and as an orange tab. The two versions do have distinct elements, like the number of belt loops or the certain stitching on the inside of seams and stuff like that, though largely speaking the silhouette is mostly the same. But this does add a new flavor to the 505 and lots of different variations to some of these elements that had previously been pretty standardized along the 505 lines. So if you have an orange tab 505, you can be pretty confident that that pair of jeans is no older than the early 80s. And since the orange tab line was officially closed down in 1999, any of your 505 orange tab jeans are going to be vintage or older than 20 years old by virtue of them being orange tabs. So within the history of the orange tab 505, there are a few distinguishing elements that can give us a closer idea as to their age if we don't have the care tags or anything attached to them. One is that the back patch on the orange tab early on in the 80s, between the early 80s and the mid 80s, had an extended lot number. And that extended lot number looks something like this. It's like 20505 rather than simply just 505 with the dash and then the material code. This would give us an information as to whether or not it was intended for a men's jean or if it was a women's jeans. Women's jeans tended to have an extended lot number of 18505 and men's had 20505. Now this changed in the late 80s when they dropped the extension on the 505 and they actually dropped the material code as well. And it just read 505. And this lasted through the late 80s all the way to the end of the Orange Tab Lifeline in 1999. So if you have a pair of late 80s and 90s 505s, it's going to have simply just 505 written in bold on the back patch. So I hope this information is helpful. I know it can be a lot, so if you need to rewatch, go back and rewatch and slow it down if you need to, because there is a lot of information. Totally understand that. If it was helpful, please drop a like, subscribe, and maybe hit the super thanks if you want to. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.